functioning. Yeah. Thank you, Rajiv. Thank you, NK, for a brilliant exposition. You've made my task very much easier because you've said much of all, or if not all, of what needed to be said. Let me state at the outset that I am in full agreement with NK that the issue is not democracy versus development. I think that's a false positioning of the question, because for India, democracy is not an optional choice. It is a necessity. I don't think you can govern a country as large, as diverse, as heterogeneous as India unless you do it democratically. And it is India's democracy, let us not forget, which has enabled us to cohere as a nation. If you look to the west of us, our neighbor Pakistan, which had excessive centralization, did not give space for the fulfillment of regional aspirations, lost half of its country in its effort to impose a centralized rule on the eastern part of Pakistan. So certainly authoritarian centralism is not something with which India would be comfortable. We are also naturally anarchic. You know, if there is a rule, if there is a fence which is put on the road or a divider, we will always find ways of either jumping over it or going around it. So I don't think that any alternative to democracy would really suit the Indian anarchical genius. Secondly, let me say, because we've heard, you know, sometimes very despairing kind of, you know, expositions here from this podium about the lack of political leadership, about how, you know, the kind of heroic space that our leaders had captured after the freedom struggle has dwindled and diminished into some kind of venality of politics today. I think it's very good to remember and to keep in mind that no democracy was born through immaculate conception, you know, fully formed as a mature adult. If you take a look at the evolved or mature or developed democracies today, they have all gone through such periods. If you take a look at America, after the first flush of the War of Independence and the tall democratic leaders that threw up, America was also subject to enormous corruption. You had the era of the robber barons, as they were called. You know, Gore Vidal, one of the American authors, says, you know, of that period, he describes a senator and he says, you know, they said of him, that senator, that he was honest because once he was bought, he stayed bought. So, you know, it's not as though this is something which is uniquely, you know, Indian and that we are going through. But the important thing, and in fact, if you look at America, you've had political antagonisms which led to civil war and the loss of an enormous number of lives. But I think the important thing about democracy is that it has a process of self-correction. And I think that is its strength, that we can turn a critical eye onto ourselves and then take measures to improve. So these democracies have improved, have evolved through a gradual process of self-correction as problems became visible, as people demanded better governance, laws were formed, regulations were developed, executive action was taken to improve democratic functioning. So I think the question for India really is not democracy versus development, but how do you develop in a democracy? Now, Rajiv mentioned that India is going through a period of political fragmentation. And I think we are in a process of enormous economic and social transition. We have a culture, we have a society which was frozen till freedom, And then through the various kind of changes that we have brought about, we have seen huge change and churning in our democratic processes. We've seen a deepening and broadening of our democracy with the entry of marginalized groups who were never active in the political system or in the polity before. We have seen the emergence of strong regional leaders and a pull towards greater regionalism in the polity. We have seen the emergence of the challenges of governance in a 24-hour media circus, which thrives on sensationalism. It's a challenge that all countries are facing and grappling with, because you can always be made to look as though you are not governing by focusing on one issue at a time. And at the same time, we are facing this enormous increase in aspirations of the young who are impatient for change. And therefore, this churning, this change is taking place in our democracy, which can sometimes lead to paralysis, as we are seeing now. But it is not that paralysis is inevitable, as we have seen after 91. Because the same country, the same political leaders, and with the same kind of political fragmentation, was able to undertake the major economic reforms of 91, which reoriented our economy, deregulating internally, dismantling the license permit Raj, opening up externally through liberalizing trade and investment. And this was achieved by a government which was in a minority, which did not have an absolute majority in the parliament. Then we saw that post-91, there was a broad compact, and therefore, even though different parties, different coalition governments came into power, the reforms continued, and there was a certain kind of national consensus on taking the reforms forward. What we have seen is that this, despite all the problems of our democracy, delivered growth of 8 to 9%, before the global economic crisis. And if you look at all the audit reports which have come, they are for this period. So we sometimes think that we can't grow because we have so much of petty corruption and so on. But the truth is that the period of those scams was also the period of the highest growth for India. It was 8 to 9% during that period. What we have seen since in the last few years is the fraying of this consensus of how to take India forward. And this in turn has led to policy paralysis. I think, given the fact that for India, maybe the era of coalitions is here to stay, or else the Indian voter has to take a conscious choice and strengthen the national parties. But if we don't do that, then we look at an era in which coalition government is going to be the norm. Then I think we have to very seriously strive to build a consensus across parties, as we had post-91, on the broad contours of social and economic reform to take India forward as a democracy. And I think it should not be difficult to do this if we as a society look beyond the factors which motivate us to vote. Because, sometimes when we criticize political parties, I think we forget that we vote the political parties to power. And if we allow issues of caste, religion, ethnicity, linguistic distinction, if we allow politics to really be played out against the fault lines of society, instead of demanding from our leaders that, okay, this is fine, but what are you going to do to develop society as a whole, then we will get the leaders whom we vote. So I don't think that we can absolve ourselves of that culpability and responsibility to try to steer the polity in a direction which will take India forward, and to demand of political parties, at least the key political parties. There will be outliers, there will be parties who may not subscribe, but as long as the key political parties arrive at a consensus along with the society as a whole about how we are going to do both social and economic development, because both have to proceed in tandem in a democracy, then I think that we will be able to combine both democracy and development. Now, what are the issues on which, we need a consensus? And I think NK very ably touched on many of them, and many of these are issues which I would like to repeat. How do we improve our parliamentary functioning? Do we begin a debate on how to fund political parties or elections? Because the question of electoral funding or political funding is a key question which all democracies have grappled with, and none, I think, has solved it to perfection. But there are various models in front of us, whether it is state funding of elections and political parties, as in Germany, whether it is, to have greater transparency of political funding and ceilings which are enforced, as in America, and so on. Incentives for bringing funding over the table rather than under the table. And these are issues which we should debate as a society, and which the political parties must also debate, because otherwise they are losing their credibility, and I think that's dangerous. If we begin to develop a mood which goes into politician bashing and says all political parties, sab chor hai, and things like that, then I think that's a counsel of despair, and it's also dangerous because, it can pave the way to a loss of faith in democracy. So I think these are issues which we should not hide under the table, brush under the carpet. We need to discuss them. Also, we need to look at how we can strengthen our federalism, because I don't think that India can be governed, there's no one size fits all. There are different states at different levels of development. There are different states which have complete literacy. There are states which have very low levels of literacy. There are states which are industrial states. There are states which have no industry at all. So the levels of development of different states precludes a one-size-fits-all approach. And therefore, strengthening federalism is an important element. And I think strengthening the last level of democratic functioning, because we have the center, we have the state governments, but below the state governments, I think the state governments have been extremely reluctant to strengthen municipal bodies and to improve their functioning, and to strengthen village panchayats in terms of giving them actual responsibility, because through fiscal authority to spend. I mean, I saw an article by a village sarpanch, a lady who's educated abroad, has come back in Rajasthan and is working as the sarpanch of her village. And she says that she has absolutely no authority to prioritize the spending in that village. There are tide schemes which come. This is for ICDS. This is for, MNREGA. This is for this. But the priority of her village, for instance, would be water, because water is such an important issue. But she is not in a position to reprioritize. She is not in a position to sanction schemes. She has to go to the Rajasthan state government, and each item of expenditure has to be sanctioned from there. So she feels a sense of frustration at not being able to develop on the ground. So this last mile democratization, which has remained absent from our polity, is something we need to work on. Also to improve urban governance, because our urban governance structures have arisen as a result of accumulation or accretion of different systems at different points of time. There's no single authority. Somebody is responsible for law and order, somebody else is responsible for civic development. Some mayor has no authority at all. And then you have rotation. I mean, to have a rotational civic leadership means that that civic leadership has no stake in the city, because the next rotation might come only after their political careers are over. In the West, if you take a look, mayors of cities are very powerful, and many national level leaders have emerged after being mayors. For instance, Germany, Helmut Schmidt was the mayor of Hamburg. Willy Brandt was the mayor of Berlin. The mayor of Stuttgart is an independent, not aligned to any political party, elected for a term of 7 years by the people there because they think he's good. Similarly, in the US, if you take a look at some of their key mayors of New York or Chicago or so on, they play a very important role in their national life. So if we are going to see an increasing urbanization of India, are our systems of governance, because this is where people feel government. You know, what happens at some esoteric level, you know, between companies and the government may not impinge on your and my life. But what happens at the level of civic governance, or lack of it, or confusion, is something which impinges on all our day-to-day lives. So I think a serious debate on how to improve urban governance, how to improve village governance, and how do we effectively delegate and strengthen institutions. I think the next point would be to strengthen the institutions of governance, because what we've seen, and this is what NK had referred to as how do we firewall institutions from excessive politicization. Because the fragmentation of politics in the states, especially in the poorly governed states or states where there's not much political stability, has led to a politics of vendetta. So the steel frame of the Indian administrative system, which is really a neutral, independent a permanent, neutral, independent civil service, which can give its advice without fear or favor, is increasingly being compromised at the state level. Societies like the US have a revolving door system at the federal level, where, you know, the senior officials basically can be appointed by the new government which has been elected. And at the same time, they've tried to ensure that the kind of nepotism or arbitrariness which they may have experienced in such appointments in the past are minimized by ensuring Senate committee confirmation for these appointments. But I think in a society like India, or a polity like India, where institutions of civil society outside government are weak, I don't think this system will work. So if we are to have a steel frame which in a sense safeguards us against periods of political turbulence, against volatility in the polity, against fragmentation in the polity, then I think it's important that we do, as N.K. Singh said, look at how to firewall institutions, to strengthen them so that they don't become subject to excessive politicization by political parties across the spectrum. Then, of course, I would say, looking at infrastructure. And I think this is an important area where political parties must agree on how we develop the infrastructure that India needs to actually accelerate economic momentum and improve the lives of its people. I think in manufacturing, we certainly need to develop a consensus which would allow us to be competitive, because we cannot build an economy for India purely on the basis of services. You know, at some stage there was this clever kind of talk that India, you know, just as the West is moving from the industrialized economy to a post-industrial service economy, India can leapfrog and go straight to a service economy. But we have masses of people who are illiterate. We have 65% of our people dependent on agriculture or living in the rural areas, and agriculture is now contributing only 15% to GDP. How do you provide them gainful employment, transition them to an urban economy in an organized, orderly manner? Otherwise, it will happen helter-skelter, and we will see increasing chaos in our urban centers. Now, this requires a very far-sighted program of strengthening our manufacturing capacities, particularly in labor-intensive manufacturing, which would require addressing some of the issues of labor, land, capital, which make us uncompetitive. It means that we have to focus very seriously on skill development. And skill development, I think, we need to introduce in many schools at the 8th standard, not post-school when kids have dropped out of school. I think combining education, regular education, with a skill which would provide employment opportunities would be a very important way to take India forward. And then, of course, improving educational opportunities, because that is what will enable people to participate rather than remain as lumpen aspirants outside the system, always available for volatile violence because they want, but they don't have the tools to meet their needs. And finally, I would say, also laying stress on expanding agrarian industries so that alternative employment opportunities become available in the agrarian economy, which would also mean developing rural infrastructure in a way that this is possible. So, for instance, you know, on the skilling side, MNREGA, can we use it to build skills in addition to just giving doles? Because at the end of the day, your objective should be to migrate people out of doles rather than just creating a system of perpetual dependence on doles. Yes, it's a good scheme, but how do we improve it so that we can actually enable people to stand on their own feet? I think these are some of the suggestions that I would have, but I am not pessimistic. I think that eventually what India will deliver is what we demand that India deliver. And at some periods of time, it's also good to have the checks and balances of a democracy on reform, because when we were doing our reform in '91, and if you compare what we achieved, let's say with what the East Europeans did, because they went by the book, you know, the advice that they were given, do everything across the board, have a cold shower, all reforms at once. And their economies plunged deeply into depression. They went through almost a decade of negative growth and have only now begun to emerge from it. India, you know, we kind of put our foot gingerly into the water and kept plunging it deeper as we developed confidence. It was an evolutionary process because social and political sustainability are as important in a democracy as economic viability. And I think the challenge for us in future is how we will combine both economic viability and political and social sustainability. It is not rocket science. I think we can do it, but it's also up to us as a society to build the polity and economy that we want. Thank you.